Hey everyone, thank you for coming to the CMU International Film Festival's live discussion event for Sama. My name is Gus, and I'm one of the event coordinators at the CMU International Film Festival. And I'll be helping to facilitate today's discussion. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Today's event is being recorded, and by joining us, you are agreeing to have your participation recorded, as we will have this video posted on our website for future reference. To make sure this event functions smoothly, all of your microphones will be muted throughout the discussion. If you would like to speak, please use the raise hand function on the bottom bar of the screen. For those unfamiliar with Zoom, you could find this by clicking on the participant tab. You could also write comments using the chat function, also located on the bottom of the screen. We'll have a Q&A at the end where you can ask questions and provide comments. To keep things fluid, we ask that you hold off on questions until then. Again, you can use the raise hand function, and then I'll unmute you and the floor will be yours. If you prefer not to speak, please write a question in the chat box at that time, and I will ask the question on your behalf. I'd now like to introduce you to tonight's moderator, Robyn Rowley, a researcher in feminist media and cultural studies at CMU.
Thank you so much, Gus. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to thank the board members of Femme for inviting me to be involved with this event, and most of all to Sana Mustafa for joining us tonight for this discussion. I'll turn it over to Seema, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, I'm Seema. I'm another moderator for this event, and I'm a senior in MECI, and I'm the president of Femme, which stands for Feminists Engaged in Multicultural Matters in Education, which is a mouthful on why we go with Femme for now. But I'm going to hand it over to Mashia to introduce herself quickly.
Hi everyone, I'm Mashia. I'm a junior studying computer science, and I'm the vice president of Femme. Today it is my honor to introduce our special guest, Sana Mustafa. Sana Mustafa is a Syrian refugee and an activist for refugee rights and inclusion. Sana is a close friend of Waad Al-Kateab, the filmmaker of Sama, and Waad's and Sana's friendship began when their parents became very close, and they even had a double wedding together. In 2013, during the Syrian uprising, Sana's father was detained by the Assad regime, and today is still listed amongst the disappeared in Syria. After being forced to flee Syria, Sana's mother and sisters became refugees in different parts of the world. Sana received political asylum in the US and has since become an active and empowering leader and public speaker. She is a founder of the Network for Refugee Voices, a refugee-led coalition working to increase refugee engagement in the international community. Under the precept, "Nothing about us without us," the organization works to pursue inclusive, sustainable, and effective refugee and immigration policy. Currently, Sana serves as the Associate Director of Partnership and Engagement at Asylum Access, an international organization that works on challenging legal barriers that keep refugees from living safely, moving freely, working, and attending school. Sana is also the board member of Syria's first Syrian women's political movement, whose aim is to unite women from different professional fields and across ethnic lines to ensure a vision for women's inclusion in a future Syria. We are so excited to be speaking with you today, and I'll now pass off to Robyn to start our conversation.
Thanks so much, Masha. So my first question, as we begin, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit, Sana, about your initial experience leaving Syria and coming to the US. I know you mentioned you initially felt ambivalent about the label Syrian refugee. And so can you talk a little bit further about this and your identity as a Syrian woman refugee in the US?
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Mashia and Seema, for this very humbling introduction. You guys have done the research. Like, this is not my bio, this is a lot of research. So thank you for that. And yeah, as Mashia has mentioned, my family, Waad and I grew up and we were born into a very, very political families. And so even before the revolution in Syria, I would speak about my family. My dad had been very, very active and politically outspoken against the Assad regime. And so I really grew up into so much knowledge and so much awareness about the oppressive environment that we were growing up in. It wasn't normal. And in the private space that was discussed, that was talked about, but then, in the public sphere, we knew exactly how to exist without causing so much trouble that would bring attention. But yet we still brought a lot of attention to us even before the revolution started and eventually the war. Actually, my father was detained in 2006 before the revolution for our political opinions. But, living kind of in Syria, being born and raised there, and kind of, having this awareness, yet really knowing how to operate in this environment, kind of created a lot of anger internally inside us as a family, and my sisters and I, of like, this is just like not okay, and refusing this. And with the Arab Spring starting in Tunisia and in Egypt, just like so many other Syrians, it was a big, big moment. I remember my father's when Mubarak stepped down in Egypt that day. I mean, it had never happened in the region history that a dictator stepped down, I mean, in a way. So it was, my dad cried for the first time. I saw him crying, and it was like he never imagined, as a 50 years old at the time, that he would witness such a moment in his life. And so for me, at 19 years old at the time, it was like, wow, like I'm 19, I'm witnessing this, like we are the revolution, we the young people then. And so Waad, myself, and I, and so many other Syrians took over the streets, and we protested. And this is how it started in Syria. It was a people's revolution. And I felt like this is an important message that always Waad, through the film, and all of us, those who are outside of Syria, tried to deliver. It's not a civil war. Like it's a multi-layered conflict. Part of it, at time of it, it was a civil war. Now it's a war, but it has always been a revolution. And of course, we were met immediately with violence and detention and torture by the Assad regime. My sister and I ourselves were detained. Gratefully, we were released. And my father was detained and was released. And eventually in 2013, my father was taken again, was kidnapped by the Assad regime intelligence forces, and that was it. I mean, in 2013, what really changed is that the situation had really escalated in Syria, and it just 2012 and 2013 were dramatic in the sense those who got detained never came back. And so when my dad was taken by the Assad regime, I had just made it to the US to 6-week scholarship program that I was supposed to like come and go back. And I came with a carry-on, and I was the first in my family to ever leave Syria, like going back generations. Like it was a big deal, and it was during the revolution. It was like, yes, like go civic, like it was about leadership, and yes, like go do this and come back. And I remember very well being in the classroom on July 2nd, 2013, and I had just like been here for a week, and receiving a message from my sister on Facebook saying that our father was taken. Literally, she's like, he's taken, we're leaving. And my mom and my other 2 sisters smuggled immediately and left the country, fearing for their lives in Syria, considering how the Assad regime is known for using women against, as political weapon. And this is when our journey started. And Waad herself, after a short time, she had already been in Aleppo in the university, and basically she went into the siege, and she lived under the siege, and like some of us left, so it's like basically everyone had a different story and different routes, and we never chose that in a way. And being here as a refugee, yes, I mean, this is like another journey. It's like, after speaking up against like a 50 years old dictatorship, I came here and I found exclusion. I literally was like, I came here and like, it's America, democracy and freedom. Like those are the things we were asking for in the protest. And that's really what I found, people talking about like me without me. Not like people sharing how does it feel like to be a refugee and they were not refugees, people deciding on policies and like solutions, and really like just not representative. And not only about representation, it's about the content, it's about the what's missing from the conversation. And then I found myself confronting another fight. And this has been like my fight as well, in addition to continuing to speak up for Syria, is the fight towards inclusion and representation. And I tried at the beginning, like with my, like baby steps of survival in the US as well, like claiming asylum and going back to school and trying to speak English. I started, with like reclaiming the narrative. So I was doing a lot of storytelling, which eventually, I was like, while doing storytelling, which could be very tokenized, I was at the same time trying to use this platform to make sure it's not tokenistic. And then I, accompanied that with policy advocacy to make sure that if there is no policy, I believe in policy change. I believe things change when policies change. Things change when there is legal rights. Things don't change by food and shelter, and emphasizing on this for decades, clearly. And this is where my passion has been in the past years. And this is how I have been kind of trying to change the label and reclaim it.
That's amazing that all the work you've been able to do with your foundations and to be able to make that a reality, how you had this vision of actually making some change beyond just having people go into giving food and stuff and make it so that their voices are heard. So it's so amazing to hear your story behind how you came to do that. Also, it kind of has a little bit to do with our next question, but I will let Robyn go first, the comment.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say your story is so compelling, and also just thinking about the kind of push and pull between representation and tokenism in this context. And then I also appreciated just what you said about, which really came through for Sama, that it's the portrayal of the conflict in Aleppo as a civil war versus the way that Waad showed this really kind of jubilant moment in I think it was toward the middle of the film, where people are really celebrating their fight for their home. And that was really powerful too. Seema, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah. So one of our next questions actually has to do with film, and also what Robyn was just talking about with some of the hope and jubilance that was happening. So we really noticed in the film that there was a big theme of hope and resilience, and it was really symbolized through Sama, who became a point of hope for her family and actually the entire community of the hospital and in Aleppo. So especially when Waad and Hamza returned to Aleppo, Waad had remarked that the hospital community was more excited to see Sama than her and Hamza. And how do you bring this kind of resilience, hope, and optimism into your work, particularly in the American context? Refugees may be separated from family members and friends. And how do you cope with isolation, loneliness in this situation where you might be separated, and even confront the ignorance and xenophobia that you may face while coming to somewhere else? And in general, the other thing we were wondering is, how do you stay hopeful and optimistic when you're surrounded by so much destruction and death?
Wow, that's a very loaded question. Yeah, I think Waad and all of us, like a lot of people like ask Waad, and it's like, why did you have a baby when there's a war? And or like, they always people always question, like, why would you basically it's like the baby was hope and was a way of survival, and it's a way of continuation, and it's a revolution and a resistance it's a form of resistance on its own. And I think when you believe in something, I mean, it's just it grounds you, and it really empowers you, and it just makes you willing to sacrifice everything, yet give everything to it. And sacrificing doesn't mean like wanting to die. Sometimes like actually resistance, as I said, is like having a baby in the middle of all of this. That's a way of resistance. That's a way of standing your ground into like what you believe in. And I would speak definitely for Waad and for myself. With everything we have sacrificed and gained from the past 10 years is because we inherently believe in this. This is not a cause for us, really. It's like, it's our existence. it really it goes to our very core existence. And I always like, these are one of the identities that for us are existential. And it's again, like I always think, it's not like something we just decided to care for. When something is that personal, and I always say like the personal is political and our own existence is political. And similarly, as a refugee, this identity that was imposed on me had become existential as well. It is life or death for me. It is how I am seen. It is how I am represented, and it's what shaped me. It's one of the experiences that shaped me. So having this other kind of first-hand lived experience made it existential for me, and as a result, I don't see my work as work. I also see it personal. But it's all grounded in the set of beliefs of the right for representation, the right for every single person to live in a country, in a place that they are respected and not discriminated against based on anything. And I would say this is the ground for all of this. And this is what really keeps us going. You know, like there has been a lot. I mean, you see from the film what Waad has seen, what has lived. And you know, I have seen my share, other people have seen their share. And I think what keeps us going, this really strong belief in this, and also just knowing, honestly, it's just part of existence to sacrifice things. And of course, for example, you know, with my father, it's really very difficult to not know. And it's a very unusual loss, because it's not a loss, it's not present, it's not dead, it's not alive, it's not was, like it's just, and you might never have a closure and you might never know. So it's really like, you know, it's very, very difficult mentally. And I have to say this, like, it's not perfect picture. You know, it's myself and a lot of Syrian survivors like struggle a lot with mental health, struggle with access to mental support after fleeing. Like people think when you flee, like you're safe and it's like cozy, lovey-dovey. Actually, like another fight starts. Like on top of everything you dealt with, on top of everything you're still dealing with from home, because it's not over, it's continuing. You're also dealing with, you come to the country and there's like set of policies against you and xenophobia and discrimination for all your different identities as a woman and as like a person of color and as a refugee and as a Muslim and as maybe queer. You know, you just like, it continues. And unfortunately, the more marginalized you are, the less access to support you have. And this is one of the things that, you know, I definitely talk about and I try to advocate for in my work in terms of having access to mental health and support. And that's the same with Waad. I think we all think about, like, if you think about Waad and her family, like the first thing they should be offered, like a very legit mental health support. And I don't think that this is offered. You know, it's just, we always think about the other things and we don't talk about this enough. So thank you for asking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's just to see, just through the eyes of Waad in the documentary is very eye-opening to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I just appreciated having that moment to sort of see through her eyes and get a little glimpse of it, but learning from your biography and kind of thinking beyond the context of the conflict itself and thinking about the effect of American policies in particular on refugees and how harmful they are in just isolation and of course the cultural problems that we also have in this country. So thank you.
And on Syria, you know, Waad's one of the main messages that what For Sama does that other documentaries on Syria don't do is that it's the first film that actually addresses the root cause. It shows you, it's like the airplanes of the Assad regime and Russia just like bombing people. All films on refugees avoided the political conversation as if we're like, refugees just like fell out of the sky. Like there's a reason we are refugees and no one talks about this reason. And if they talk, they say the civil war or the war and that's it. And Waad is it's really the first film that shows you the revolution. And it also shows you who's behind what's happening in Syria. And for us, And I think that was very important for Waad because we struggle with the mainstream Western narrative about Syria, like just being like the average public understand this as being like Iraq, or like it's like there's terrorists and there's Daesh. Don't think even of the Assad regime, of Russia, of Iran. And like the best would understand it, again, would put it back to civil war. So we feel there's a big narrative that we're trying to counter. And that was like definitely a message that Waad was trying to get across through this film.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think that the documentary itself just shows like the complexity of the conflict of the human experience as you're like living in a conflict zone like this. And I think what your note about how our different layers of like identity interact and shape your experience in Syria and also afterwards was really like insightful. And kind of building on that component of identity, we noticed that in most of the film, like many of the scenes were of men. There were a few women in the public space. And so we were wondering, like, what would it have been like for Waad to be documenting these scenes as like a female journalist? And even if you could speak to your own experiences prior to leaving Syria, like how did your identity as a woman kind of shape your experience protesting and being kind of like a political activist before you left, or even after when you came to the US?
Yeah, there are so many environments in Syria that we lived in and operated in. And you know, I mean, Syria is really one of the countries that is just, it wasn't your like cliche, like Middle Eastern countries where women don't have rights, but it wasn't also your like, it was in the US where people have like so much rights, women have like amazing rights. It was really kind of like, it's really changed from a city to another, from a community to another, and from minority to another. And we just like from a neighborhood to another, like in Damascus, like in Maidan, where like we protested, like it's a more conservative area, whereas like the street next to it where we also protested, it was very different. So the dynamics were different, but we protested in both places. So I'm just like, my message here first is that each area and each environment, like there were multi-environments. The environment that was Waad in during the siege, it was definitely a more conservative environment, socially speaking. And that had its advantages and disadvantages. But you know, Waad was very respected in the community, even in that community. So she had the trust of the people, between even men and women. So it wasn't very difficult for her like to roam around. And but at the same time, being a woman gave her access to private spaces to be with other women that otherwise you couldn't have had access to. But besides, like you know, in the siege also, when she left, Waad left Syria with around 500 hours of filming, and for her, leaving with the hard drives was life or death situation. I think being a woman helped a lot to smuggle those out. And like she talks a lot about like she had them like literally like close to her chest, you know, beneath what she was wearing, the hijab and the coat. And it was like, if they will take them, they will take her with them, like life or death. If she will die, she will die with it. If she will live, she will live with it. And I think, and for us, like protesting during the revolution as women, again, it changed from a neighborhood to another, but my personal experience was very empowering. I felt very empowered as a woman. I protested like I wanted to protest. I wore the things I wanted to wear. And if anything, there was a moment of solidarity across our ethnic and religious backgrounds, because we're under this. I was like standing to people who wear like hijab or wear something different or have a completely different set of beliefs than me, but we were unified towards something. So all those other barriers really did not matter at that point. And speaking of that, I just want to say like the role of Syrian women during the revolution and the war and even after fleeing is tremendous. I mean, especially with most of the men had been, taken, detained, or killed, Syrian women found themselves in places where really we had to do what we had to do. When it was fighting, women fought. When it was, documenting, that was Waad's tool. That was like what she could do. Did that. When it was nursing, they did that. When it was leading a group, did that. And also when fleeing. And the only reason we continue to exist because our mothers keep us around, because our mothers keep us together. And also when we can now make sure that we are part of any future of Syria, that's like our way to continue to show leadership. So I know there's of course, women suffer also a lot because in such situations, because they are already marginalized, but at the same time, there's a lot of leadership that has risen because of this too.
That's really uplifting and inspiring to hear that, and to think about the ways that this was really empowering for you as or for women that participated, is maybe a more latent effect that we don't hear about. Similarly, to think about Waad smuggling out those hard drives in that moment while they're trying to get to that final checkpoint, the focus is somewhat on Hamza because of his visibility. Yeah. And I didn't even think about the situation that Waad was in that moment, smuggling out this important footage that she had, sacrificed so much to collect.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's really, really powerful to think about. I want to make sure that we give folks from the audience enough time to ask some questions. So, one thing I wanted to ask you before we open it up, you've invoked this phrase, nothing about us without us, and it's so powerful. Besides sharing personal narratives like for Sama with others, what are some of the ways that college students and members of our community can help to do that, to uplift refugee voices and to try to amplify them, sure that their rights and interests are included?
Yeah, I think it's really the internal personal work first would reflect on the interpersonal, and then would lead to systematic change. And I would say whoever we are, it's very important to question who we are into anything we're interested in, where we sit, what do we bring. If you decide to work for a not-for-profit organization or just to work on refugee issues, it's very important to come to this realizing and knowing exactly what identities you come with, what position you hold, what power you also bring by existence, and then how is that your existence is helpful in a way that actually not to help the people, but to actually give power to the people. So I mean, it's all about, similarly as we talk in other conversations on Black rights and how to be a good ally, it's actually not much different. I always say we have come finally to a time where we don't accept to talk about women rights without women or Black rights without Black, but we still accept to talk about refugee rights without refugees. And it's not there's not much of a difference at all. So it's really not it's one of those things that also doesn't require another cause that you have to think about how to be a good ally. It's really, I think it all lays down of always being aware of who you are in the space and the time, and thinking about how can you use who you are to really address that whatever cause you care about in the root cause, and transfer power to those who need it. And how do you do that? Then the other question become, how do you do that with being culturally sensitive about different dynamics and different cultures, and so there's a lot of awareness that needs to be done there. And I think then you think about how do you change the people around you, or your environment, or the community or the organization you work in, and what does that mean in practice? Because it's one thing to have this in values and principle, it's another thing to really see it in practice. And that's why your representation is one of the ways, it's actually one of the fastest ways that leads to inclusion and change. if we allow this representation to be meaningful, not tokenistic. And that's again one of the other things. Like, for example, I do this with I did this in my consulting with a couple of organizations where like they are like organizations that want to do something on refugees or design a project, or they work on refugees, and they want to do it with refugees, and then they have no refugees on their staff, or like no like just in any leadership or decision-making position. And it's really one of the fastest ways that I found through those projects is that once you have the people as co-leading things with you, this is when just change follows. You don't need to think about it from Z to A. Like, actually A is where it starts. And this is one of the things that I always recommend and talk about.
Thank you. Seema, do we have a question from the chat?
Yeah, we have a question from, sorry if I pronounce your name, Jimena. Hopefully I said that right, but she just wanted to thank you, Sana, for this conversation. And her question was, based on your experience, if you had the power to change policies to help refugees feel more welcome and belong to their asylum community, what 3 policies would you change?
Depends on the country. So it really depends. But in general, the policies that I feel people do, the things that people always lack for refugees is the sense of stability that comes from having protection, that comes from having legal status, long-term legal status. Most refugees, like even like now I have an asylum, for example, in the US. A lot of people have TPS, like temporary protection. It's temporary, so it's in nature temporary, which does not help in contributing in any way of you feeling have protection, have stability in this country, or like could stay safely. You just, it's basically could be revoked any minute. The other one is asylum, which it's a longer term, but at the same time, like, you could get it, you could not, and then you will apply for citizenship, which like there's more sense of long-term solution, but it's still like not. And this is like the US considered very good at this. In Germany, who brags about having 1 million refugees, those 1 million refugees, most of them have temporary status that gets renewed a year to a year. That does not help in integration, does not help in work permits, does not help in family reunification. You can't bring anyone on having a legal state for 1 year. Does not help in anything. And so having long-term legal status makes you protected. So you can't be exploited at work. You can't be exploited at any way. You can work. And that's the other thing. It's amazing once you have a legit legal status that we take for granted, that people sometimes just born with, what happens in your life. Like the average refugee in Jordan, Lebanon, or Turkey can't walk safely. They fear detention and deportation. Can't go to any medical facility, again, fearing the same. Can't work, so they get exploited and they do very low paid job, and women get exploited and can't even go fight for their rights. Can't have children. If they have children, those people are born into no identities and can't go back home. It's a list. So the first thing I would do, I would give people legal status and I would leave them after this, because everything follows.
Fascinating. I just to follow up on that, I'd ask, like, do you think kind of seeing these differences between various countries and maybe like based on your own family's experiences, like from across different countries, do you think refugee policy should be something that's standardized internationally, or when we do advocacy, should it be focused on kind of a local level of helping those in our community, or should we be kind of engaging this conversation in a much more broader scale?
It's both. I don't believe very much in globalization, because we are communities and we have different cultures and circumstances. But I do think, as we have now international treaties, those international treaties need to be revisited to at least have like a common ground of set and values. And of course, local advocacy continues to be very important because there are, nuances of the situations. I think the problem is in the system. The problem inherently is in the system. Like, this system has been put together, the UNHCR, like the UN system, has been put together for almost 70 years now, has been put on the basis that this is temporary. So actually, UNHCR has no interest in a long-term solution. They cannot, like, the ideal, I mean, how could you work on a crisis for 70 years with billions of dollars and the situation is still this way? The camps, once they're open, never closed. People still don't have rights, don't have access to education, like don't have minimum rights. I mean, if you talk about any project, someone doing this for 70 years, you'd be like, you're not succeeding at this, clearly you're failing. But we don't dare to say this. I mean, the mere existence of UNHCR is based on my existence. Why would they eliminate my existence? Why would they fix my situation? And so the system is inherently problematic and need restructuring, because this system was put by white men in Geneva and New York who have zero experience or proximity to forced displacement.
You mentioned a few times about, I'll give it to you in a second. You mentioned a few times about how problematic it is for it to be temporary, and that's such a good point. That's not considered ever. It seems like it's always, you just have to open the doors for refugees, and that's all. And that's the only thing that really seems to be talked about in the media. But no one ever talks about the problems that causes, or how it isn't a solution to the problem. It's just something that's the solution, even though it's really just a very temporary, not really solving anything whatsoever. So I just wanted to comment a bit on that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It just made me think about you saying nothing about us without us. Just not having refugee voices is a huge part of the problem, and why this project has been going on so long.
Implications. I mean, it has implications. It's not about, like, it's really not about how it looks only because people need to have voices and give them the mic. It's actually movements led by those most affected, successful, period. Women like rights movement would have not succeeded if it was not led by women. LGBT right movements, the same. So similarly, this could not, it's important to the substance, to the outcome of solving this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also, underlines why the personal is so political.
Yeah.
In all of these movements. I want to give folks that are listening a chance to ask you some questions also. And while those questions are coming in, I'll turn it back to Seema.
Yeah, so in the meantime, before we have any questions come in, one thing that we wanted to ask as well was, if there was one message you wanted viewers to take away from the film, what would it be?
I think it's the message that Waad said when she was at the Oscars, which was like, we dare to dream and we won't ever regret this. Because I feel everyone looks at us and be like, look where Syria is, like, don't you regret this? And as if like it's an outcome of us. I mean, it's like, you blame those who spoke up, you don't blame the murderer. And this is one of the things that really hurt all of us, because this revolution, people who revolt, you don't blame them. You blame the system that reacted to us in this way. You blame the whole international community that watched us being killed. You blame the Obama administration for doing nothing. You blame you blame Russia, you blame Iran. You just don't blame the people who spoke up because you beaten them up. And that was my Waad message, and this is always our message. Yeah, we dare to dream. We will never regret that. And no one should have the entitlement to question even our hope about Syria. I think going forward, I faced this with my dad, about my dad. People are like, yeah, I'm sure he's dead by now. Like, you should find closure on your own and like move forward. I mean, wow, like, or like Syria is done, is over. I think, yeah, just like, this is not okay to say. And yeah, once I hope everyone gets to believe in something and fight for it, then everyone will understand.
That is such a powerful message, to never go back on what you believe in and to just keep fighting for it, and to not have regrets when you know in your heart that it's the right thing to do. And also, I'm so sorry that people were saying that, just assume that he's dead.
Thank you.
You know, one thing that really struck me is thinking about Waad making these videos and then posting them and people being able to see them. And she comments, you know, so many people were seeing these videos that she was making and no one was doing anything. And so I think there's a tension between like this inaction on behalf of the entire world, but also a sense of just growing the ability to reach so many people. And so I'm curious if you could comment on the ways that technology and digital platforms have helped in these kinds of crises, for just to increase the audience that's able to witness.
Yeah, 100%. It has helped a lot. However, it's not what it's so funny. When I came here, like the mainstream media was calling it like the Facebook revolution. I mean, as if we really just like, it's really undermines a lot of like people's efforts. Just one message. But besides that, definitely, social media helped a lot. Different platforms in mobilizing, especially in countries where closed countries where we really have no outlets to the world. I mean, Syria, you know, I think it was 2003 when we had internet for the first time, and of course, very limited and censored, and it continues to be censored, obviously. And during the revolution, it was like still like the early days of Syrian people like getting on Facebook and being on Facebook, and then it was we can't meet in public. In Syria, like we can't gather and plan and organize in public. There, as we said, there is like an intelligent person for every Syrian. And so it was our way of overcoming like this like imposed censorship in the public sphere by using those platforms to mobilize and connect. But also it came with, you know, its own risks. But obviously we had to connect through VPNs. We learned about how to connect with VPNs and connect safely to the internet, and people outside diaspora helped a lot in providing us different tools to overcome censorship. So that really like I suddenly found myself like almost expert in cybersecurity because it was survival. Like we had to know how to connect safely to the internet. But at the same time, you know, of course we were learning and you know, I think people always like blame us of like, why didn't we do better? I mean, we never had a chance to experience anything. We never like this was our first public experience in Syria and organizing and planning and being political. And so of course we made mistakes, and it's not just like, you know, it's not just we didn't have the opportunity before. So those platforms helped a lot. They also, you know, early in the days, you like you could have fake identities on Facebook, which like now you can't. But at the time it was very helpful because, you know, we all had like revolution fake accounts where we connect with people. At the same time, it came with risks where we got infiltrated so many times, and people's actually got detained and locked up because of this. But it definitely played a huge role. And then continuing after this phase, like with Waad, when Waad was documenting and releasing a lot of the information to the media before fleeing, I mean, that was huge. Live videos were huge in Syria, especially in liberated areas. However, look, the world knows exactly what happened and nothing has changed. You would think if the world sees this, like, I mean, you really think about it, you think like if the world like had seen like Rwanda firsthand live on Facebook would do something. People saw firsthand the chemical weapons and in Ghouta and all different places, and the bombs in Aleppo, and like you have for Sama, you see all of this. Doesn't change anything. I mean, it changed people's minds and hearts, but like it doesn't save people. It doesn't change anything. And I think this is what really troubling is like, why do we have that? Why we know that much and we have that much content, and yet we're actually still like, this is not changing anything. And I feel like this is something for all of us to think about.
Yeah, it absolutely is sobering to think about. We kind of typically want to say, like, as you said, you would think if you witnessed this that immediately there would be a response, when in fact there was so much silence.
Yeah.
Masha.
Continues to be.
Yes, I wanted to say that, or thank you for sharing this, and definitely like important to be looking out for kind of the impact of these narratives. I had a question from the chat, and I also, before I say this, I want to remind everyone that feel free to ask your questions in the chat, raise your hand if you'd like to speak directly. We were asked, how do you take care of yourself and keep your personal life and work life separate, especially since your work is so personal? How are you able to speak about your lived experiences while taking care of yourself and prioritizing your mental health? And this question is from Rimsha.
I mean, this like idea about keeping work separate than personal, I understand like some people need to do this. I don't like, again, because it says I don't see a line. So I don't have this mentality. So I'm not like fighting against it. I'm just thinking in general, I do what I do. How can I exist in this way? How can I continue to exist in this way in a way that I could still wake up every day and talk to my mom and like laugh and go out and yet like speak about those things and fight against them. And it really what has helped the support system I have in the US, just people. I mean, first, my support system, I mean, gratefully, I have been really lucky with meeting really great people, like-minded and different-minded, who open my mind into new things, that continue to support me, and like we support each other. And I feel like I've been very grounded by the people around me. And secondly, mental health therapy, definitely, which I had not had access to until fall last year. I've been here almost for 8 years, and I could not navigate the mental health care system, which everyone suffers from, not only us. And I could not have access to therapy before like literally like 6 months ago. And once I did, the first thing I said, I could only imagine how I would have been if I had access to the support before, because the trauma, there's no post-traumatic disorder, because the trauma it's current. The situation in Syria is still the same. My father is still missing. The survival mode is still in. The policies have not changed. So the trauma, like the root of the cause, has not changed. So it's really it's ongoing trauma. And I could only have imagined, like, if everyone have access to this early on, what would have changed? And if everyone have access to it right now. So yeah, actually therapy, simple.
I mean, yeah, that's something that, I wish that we had more of across the board in the United States, but I absolutely believe that going through such difficulty would require a lot of that kind of care and support.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's very seen in the US as a privilege, which it is, but it's really seen as a privilege of like, when people come here, first thing we think of is like food and shelter, and really don't think of anything else, as if anything else like is really a privilege. Whereas like food and shelter, while you're really struggling, leading to suicide, which happened with so many refugees, I mean, is really equal. And I think this is what needs to change. And this is really comes from like this savory concept of, oh, like you somehow feel like if people are struggling, you have power over like what their needs are. And you should care only about food and shelter now. Like, like you should care about those basic rights, like the Maslow like pyramid, which like I definitely Western believe. And I think this is really problematic. If we change the way we think of people and we see them as humans, not as needs, and then probably we'll be more aware about those needs.
Absolutely. Jimena has another question, and she asks, if we'd like to learn about Syria, the one you love, the one you want to remember or hope back again, where shall we start to look?
March 15th, 2011, when the revolution started. This is the Syria I owned. We never owned Syria before. We never felt like free. I never felt free before in Syria. I never felt agency over that country. I never felt ownership of the streets. I never felt safe as I felt when the revolution started. I mean, we had 9 months of amazing revolutions and protests where like I felt I know those people, like we're actually like community. The Assad regime had worked on us for years to internalize fear and hating each other and fearing each other and be like, every sect is different and don't go to that neighborhood and don't go to that neighborhood. And 2011, March 15th, broke all this fear. And we found ourselves in all different neighborhoods and talking to all different people. And most importantly, for the first time, I felt I have dignity. And I could fight for it. And for me, that's the Syria I care for, and that's the Syria I love and I remember, and that's the Syria I want to go back to.
That's beautiful. Are there any other questions from others? I know Yolanta earlier, you had asked about the 500 hours of footage. Sana, you had mentioned, does Waad have other projects in mind with some of this?
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that? And if you want anything, Yolanta.
Sorry, you're muted.
You're muted. Yeah, my point was that Waad was filming when her daughter was born, and she wanted to have the documentation of the life of a baby and then younger child. But of course, you cannot separate it from the context of war, and the personal like cannot be detached from the context of the war and political situation. And she had huge material, 5 years of filming. And how did she find the filmmaker from UK who helped her to work on editing that material? How does it, what was the process that ended up with getting Oscar nomination?
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge is that, again, she left with 500 and she really did not have the idea of the film or anything specific, but she was in touch with Channel 4 as she was reporting on what's happening. And so when she gladly was able finally to seek asylum in the UK, she had stayed in touch with Channel 4 and they started talking about making something out of this footage. And of course, one of the first ideas was that to make a documentary. And I guess really it was, as Waad says, the process was very easy in terms of like Channel 4 suggested that Edward at the time and to work with Waad because she had 500 hours of footage. Like she needed another lens to also work with and with the support of Channel 4 team to think about how to make this film. And it really was, Waad was like, yes, okay. And that led into over a year of working on for Seema, and that really dedicated all her life in that year while surviving, while trying to reunite her family, and she had to leave her daughter in Turkey because of family reunification and all of those things. She's a fighter, still was doing the film, and of course has been thinking about using the rest of the material in all different ways, and one of them is for accountability and justice in Syria. So she has documented war crimes, obviously, and she very much hopes that this will be used in any process that would take place for documenting war crimes and accountability in Syria. In addition, I think there are like ideas about maybe more short films, basically continuing to use the material to show what was happening in Syria, whether for public awareness or for policy change and accountability.
Well, I hope we get to see more of this footage in the future because it's so compelling, and it's from this point of view of a woman living through this kind of conflict is powerful. Masha has our final question for you tonight, so I'm going to turn.
Yeah, well, you spoke a lot today about kind of how the different stories are presented, and specifically through this film, we see a very unique and intimate experience of kind of the revolution. And I have a question for you is, moving forward, like, how do we stay informed about human rights issues around the world when what's happening may not be reflected in mainstream media? Where can we really seek out this information?
Yeah. Local activists. I mean, really like Waad and so many other, like, I would talk about Syria at least. Many other Syrian activists who still in Syria and outside of Syria, and gladly with social media, everyone is on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and they are communicating from inside Syria and from outside of Syria through, you know, of what's happening. And there's a narrative that's basically for us is not like a phase and then you move into the other big thing in the world. We're just, this is our commitment, so we will always fight and talk about it. And therefore I would always recommend into any cause to get to know local people, get to know the people and follow them and hear from them and make sure you're sharing the platform with them. And so actually, so thank you for also creating this platform and this opportunity for me and for Waad. And another thing that makes for Seema very unique is that it was done by a Syrian woman about this. Again, like if you look at the like scheme of like documentaries about Syrian refugees, very few the ones that made by Syrians. And I think that's why the story was very different than so many others. And that's why talking with local people is one of the best ways to be informed.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us. Everyone can give a round of applause virtually. If anyone else would like to add thoughts or like final wrap up question.
Yeah, just one more time, I've shared links to the Network for Refugee Voices and Asylum Access if you want to learn more about the work that Sana does. And thank you so much to organize this event and for you being with us tonight.
Thank you
Thank
all
you so
for
much for
having
sharing.
me. Yeah, and great conversation. And I'm really excited for this. And I'm always around for even those who like we didn't get to meet. I could be reached on Twitter. Feel free to ask me any further questions. I'm accessible. So thank you for caring and asking.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.